Hi, this is Adrienne Gennett with University Museums at Iowa State. And today we are looking at some objects made by different makers in the Art Nouveau period. And this little video is in conjunction with the wonderful exhibition we have in our back decorative arts gallery, Art Nouveau Innovation. And it includes Danish porcelain from the Art Nouveau period, and it's on loan from the Museum of Danish America, an amazing collector that has brought together these really beautiful objects. That exhibition will only be up until May 9th, 2021. So once this video comes out, if you have some time, you should come and see it. Otherwise, it's moving on to its next location, which I believe is in Flint, Michigan. But today I wanted to talk about why we would borrow an exhibition like that. Art Nouveau is something we do have in our decorative arts collection, and specifically our best holdings are in glass. Art Nouveau as a movement was around 1880s to about 1910, and it was a really short period of time in design and as a style in design and decorative arts. It was also seen in architecture and a little bit of painting and what you would call fine arts, but it really was the most beautiful, I believe, in the decorative arts. So in ceramics and glass and metalwork, all different textiles, those types of things. It really, that's where Art Nouveau as a style found its beauty, I think its most beautiful moments. And so today from our collection at the University Museums, our permanent collection, I wanted to just really focus on the glass that we have. We do have other materials that have the Art Nouveau style, but I wanted to look at the glass. Art Nouveau began primarily in France, but was an international movement. So it's most associated with France when you're thinking about it, thus the name Art Nouveau. But it really was an international style. And so we have a couple different examples of that, along with, if you think of the Danish porcelain. So Denmark was not France, and quite a bit removed. So Art Nouveau was the first time that designers, artists were really kind of trying to create a wholly new type of design and decoration and style. It wasn't reminiscent of anything in the past. It sometimes did harken back to what countries or cultures did really well, whether it be luxury like in France or vernacular styles, to bring in kind of that heritage and tradition, but then took it in a completely new and unseen before format. And so the first and most important idea of Art Nouveau that you can really readily see in a lot of these objects is nature. Nature was considered the muse and one of the most important aspects of inspiration for Art Nouveau motifs. And especially that whiplash form, so that initial beginning idea of using the stem as inspiration rather than the flower, and that kind of undulating form that you see. And you see that really in a lot of Belgian Art Nouveau. They kind of use that whiplash really beautifully. But nature itself was very inspirational, and not just, again, the pretty flowers, but bugs, animals, and really kind of unique different types of plants and vegetation to be used. Women were also really important. The beautiful woman was often represented in Art Nouveau, and a whole bunch of other kind of symbolist ideas. There's a whole range of styles as it kind of moves out internationally. So in France, we have this group of objects right here. You see kind of that nucleus of Art Nouveau beginning. And Art Nouveau didn't really occur in England. Arts and crafts and the aesthetic movement were very much akin to Art Nouveau, but they didn't have kind of the same focus that Art Nouveau did. But here you see what was probably considered the best Art Nouveau glassmaker, Émile Gallé, and his glass manufactory. And this Lake Como vase, it's probably a little hard to see right now, but when you put a light inside, just glows. And this was probably made 1905, 1904-ish. And Gallé himself only lived to 1904, but he'd been making glass with his manufactory for 15 or so years before this. And Gallé was a genius with glass, and a genius artist to kind of really rethink the material itself and what he could do with it. And so he had grown up with a father that had a kind of ceramics and small goods manufactory, and inherited that and kind of moved forward into glass. And he really focused on what we call cameo glass. And if you can look at this, if you could touch it, you could feel the layers of glass. It's multiple layers of colors of glass that you then cut through to create this beautiful motif and design. So it's not painting, it's not anything like that, it's just glass. And this is an ancient technique that Romans had actually began many years, a very long time before this, and was brought back when they found those cameos. And cameos themselves, not even in glass, existed with shell and other types of hard stones, a kind of a gem cutting version of gem cutting. And so cameo glass resurges at this time. And there were two ways to do it. And the initial way was you would take your kind of initial color of glass, usually clear, and then start layering the other colors that you wanted for your design that you would then cut through. And so it's quite heavy because you have so many layers of glass. And so the initial way to do it is to hand cut it, right? Which, as you can imagine, is pretty work intensive. It takes a lot of time and effort and ability to hand cut through the layers like a gem cutter would do to create all the various designs. And so at some point, and Gallet did kind of begin in that way, they realized that, I think it's hydrofluoric acid, so they could use acid to etch through the layers and resist in various kind of dips as they went along to kind of create the same effects and the cutting, and then kind of do some hand working at the end to kind of get the feathering and the really beautiful details. And so it makes it quite a bit easier to do, obviously, and less work intensive. And so Gallet not only made these kind of a whole range of everyday goods for the middle class to wealthy to buy and have in their home, he also made very highly artistic pieces of glass. And so this is probably in the mid-range, and one of his more beautiful kind of that mid-range type of glass that was accessible to others, but probably more expensive. But he had some fully artistic, kind of wildly, these were his babies. He sold all of this other glass so that he could create these amazing works of art in glass too. And so he was working kind of within the Art Nouveau idiom of flora and fauna and nature itself, and was really kind of a botanist himself and loved botanical studies and properly depicting flora and fauna in his work. And he was based in Nancy, which is not Paris. It's part of outside of France, or outside of Paris in Alsace and Lorraine, which is a very interesting area because it's gone back and forth between Germany and France for so long. And so he really created a hub for Art Nouveau in Nancy that became very well known. And other artists that we'll talk about in a second, along with other glass artists and other artists like Louis Majorelle, furniture makers. He also made furniture in his manufactory, all in this Art Nouveau idiom. And it's probably the most recognized Art Nouveau designer. So after Gallet, there were other artists and manufacturers also popping up and working in France in this Art Nouveau style. And we have here Dôme Frère, and Dôme had been in existence for a bit of time, making just more everyday types of glassware and crystal and things like that. And here you have when they started to kind of move into that art glass and that Art Nouveau style. And they were also based in Nancy and very much working not so much against Gallet, but kind of they were compatriots, right? They were from the same area doing very similar things. And while they would all go to different fairs and kind of compete in that way, they were all kind of trying really hard to create the most beautiful glass that they could. And so Dôme, you see two really interesting pieces. This is a little earlier. This one's about 1898. And it's a really beautiful example of not just cameo glass like we talked before, so you see that in the leaves and how, the modeling, they've done this really amazing job of getting the coloration, but also, using different techniques like a hammering, a martelé type of technique on the bottom where it has almost a little ball, where the hammer points had hit the glass, obviously not how it was done, along with carving and engraving into the glass. So if you can come close to this piece of glass, you would see little bugs and bees and other pieces of vegetation and berries cut into the actual glass itself. So this to me is just a really amazing work of art for all the various styles and elements that went into just creating this one vase. And this one I've always loved too, just because it's very, it's almost a little more abstract in its design. And it's got that kind of beautiful, kind of mottled, funky green that gives it almost a marbly look. They've kind of created a glass that has this marbling. And then the cameo is a thistle pattern, and the thistle was also very much part of the history of Lorraine in that area. So they were kind of using this design to talk about who they were, which is really an interesting idea to me. And so when Gallet kind of passed away quite young in 1904, I believe the Dom Frère kind of took over that space and kind of headed up the Art Nouveau group of artists in that region. But again, we have quite a bit more of Gallet in our collection, along with quite a bit more Dom, and there's other glassmakers in France working at the same time that obviously I don't have time to bring out, so I couldn't talk about all those, but if you're interested, they're all online in our database, our museum database. So these two beautiful pieces of glass are a little bit different from what we see over here in France. And these were actually made in Bohemia. And Bohemia is an area that technically doesn't exist anymore as Bohemia, but is still the Czech Republic and Slovakia and parts of Germany. It was a kind of a amorphous region that existed for hundreds of years. And they were Bohemians, and Czechs today also were amazing glassmakers. It was part of their tradition. They were always known for making really beautiful and wonderful glass, and they continue that to this day with really wonderful contemporary Czech glassmakers. And here we have two examples from a company called Letz. And actually at this time, Bohemia was kind of under the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg rule still, so they were almost considered Austrian. So it's a really interesting history of the area and the kind of the back and forth of who you were, right? But so they really kind of had to kind of think about what did they want their Art Nouveau style to be, and Letz had a very large catalog of glass types and forms and shapes and patterns and colors all over the board, and decorative motifs were just kind of insane how many they had. And so they were not, they did do some cameo, but they recognized that they were not Gallet, and they didn't want to try and compete in that way because Gallet was the best. And so they instead kind of focused on this iridescence that we'll talk a little bit more about in these next objects too. So the iridescence in glass became very popular in the Art Nouveau period. And specifically for Tiffany, who we'll talk about, who's an American glassmaker, that iridescence was inspired by ancient objects. So ancient glass that was made in the Greek or Roman time, or even previous to that, often was buried in the ground for a long time before it was found, unearthed, and brought out. And so that burying and it being near water or moisture or humidity creates something called weathering, and that weathering becomes inherent to the piece of glass. And many times when you bring it out, that weathering has an iridescence to it. And it's incredibly beautiful, but it's not meant to be part of the glass. It wasn't something the glassmaker did in any way, shape, or form. It's just what nature has done to it. But it has this really beautiful kind of rainbow hue that artists were quite inspired by and wanted to figure out how could they create that in more contemporary glass and kind of harken back to that, what they thought was this ancient technique into this really kind of new way of design and decoration. And so these are very typically Art Nouveau. The little mounts, the ormolu mounts might have been added at a different time. They're a little over the top. But that iridescence of the gold, this is a specific type of technique that Letz had different names for. I think this is Candia Papillon. They had millions of different names. And you see the beautiful peacock. And there was also a peacock on the Como vase. And so that peacock is also very seen in a lot of Art Nouveau and in aesthetic movement from England design. There's a place called the Peacock Room that is in the Smithsonian Asian Art Museum. And this peacock, again, it's not only that it's beautiful, right? That it's an aspect of nature, but it's that those feathers really inspire people, right? It has that undulation, kind of that motif of that was already inherent to Art Nouveau. So the peacock feather really fits perfectly into what many Art Nouveau designers were already kind of going towards. And so you see the peacock quite often, along with different flowers and fauna here. And over here we've got another one. And this one's really lovely too, because again, you really see that whiplash Art Nouveau motif of kind of that undulating line. And this line, in fact, goes all the way around and wraps around. So you've got not only the interesting iridescence based on green with kind of a bluish silver, which is quite different from the gold, but then you've got this metal silver overlay. So adding another element to the glass to make it more special and more beautiful, but it's very, very typical of the Art Nouveau. It's asymmetrical, you know, it's got different thicknesses of line as it kind of swirls and naturally finds its way climbing up the vase rather than having a very specific, you know, determined symmetrical line. And so that's quite lovely in a way to perfectly represent. But you see how different, right? These are quite different looking than what we have in France. And so again, that idea that makers in different cultures and different countries are trying to figure out what does Art Nouveau mean to them and how can they best represent the style and what they make. And on this end of the table, we have the American version of Art Nouveau. And this is a little bit later, well, around the same time, but Art Nouveau kind of crossed the pond, as they say. And actually, Tiffany, who we are looking at here, many of his wares and his manufactured goods were sold in France through Art Nouveau dealers and galleries. And so he was actually quite popular in Europe and inspirational to other designers. But in America, you've got kind of this, again, focus on the iridescence in a very different way. But one of the first things I want to talk about is this amazing lamp. And so this lamp is probably what Tiffany, most people, if they know who Louis Comfort Tiffany is, think of stained glass. Tiffany was the son of Charles Tiffany, who opened the Tiffany & Company, the store that still exists today that we know that sells jewelry and silver. At that time, it sold high-end luxury goods, silver and jewelry, but many other things too. And so he was a rather well-off young kid who wanted to be an artist and traveled the world trying to become an artist and saw ancient things and was really inspired by the international, the beauty of the international cultures, the objects that they made that he had never seen before. And so he takes all of those experiences and puts it into first designing interior spaces. So he sets up this interior design company with another woman and another artist, and they start designing high-end, luxurious rooms for his father's friends or other wealthy patrons in New York City. And some of those rooms are really, really over the top, full of Moorish designs and velvets, and they're really intense to this like late 19th century Gilded Age American period. But so he then kind of shifts focus and decides he wants to make glass. And he first begins with stained glass, and he and there's another stained glass maker, John Lafarge, who are a bit competitive, both realize the traditional way of making stained glass is to have glass and then add enamel color to it. And so it's this pot glass, as they call it. So it's not very, you have to add the color to make the different designs. It doesn't have a lot of depth or texture. Oftentimes you would then paint on the images too. And so he wanted to use all glass and figure out how to use glass to create various shades and textures and depth of color throughout, rather than adding excess color on top. And he and along with this other artist, Lafarge, both came up with this idea of opalescent glass. So they created glass in sheets that was full of variations of colors and textures. Some looked like hammered, some looked freckled, some had kind of like lumps and chunks in it, which you can see in the daffodils here in their the ends of their flowers. And so this glass was then patented, and so they would then have hundreds of variations of glass that they could use to create these incredibly unique lampshades, windows, all types of things. And the windows are incredibly beautiful and very, very large usually. And the lampshades are a really wonderful way to see it in small scale. And so this was a totally new way. So you're using the glass as the actual way to create the art. And so there's a lot more leading and soldering of the joints. So so you're using that almost as a highlight to it rather than trying to make it go away. And so this daffodil lamp, too many vases. This daffodil lamp, probably made around, I think, 1905, circa 1905 or a little bit later, is one of these really great examples where, again, nature is his inspiration, especially in the lampshades. These beautiful floral forms. There's a wonderful wisteria. The dragonfly is probably the best known. We're really kind of using nature in a unique and abstract way to create these. And he also employed women, and he's well known, especially for the lampshades, that at one point he hired a couple women to see if it worked out, and then had I think about 32 within a couple years after that. And so the idea was they would do the whole kind of design of these lampshades. So the laying out of what glass should go where, how it should fit together, how it will work, and the coloration and the different motifs and decorative schemes. And so that was unique for that time period, having a woman have a job outside the home that was acceptable and considered respectable too. The bases are also really important. So this is another Tiffany base. And so they made their own bronze bases. And so you often see the shade, but not a Tiffany base, or just random Tiffany bases out there. And the bases, there's different variations, and you could kind of, I think they were interchangeable in some ways, but this one was really beautiful. And again, they have often the pond motif or different natural styles. And so this one specifically has kind of like a fern pattern that goes down into almost like a petal itself. And so when he's making all of this really beautiful stained glass, Tiffany, who's obviously not making the glass himself, he has a whole bunch of people working for him, but is kind of the artistic director and the mind and the genius of the art, starts also deciding he wants to make objects. And he actually works not just in glass, but in mosaics and ceramics and other elements too, and metalwork. But his glass blown objects become really, really incredibly well known. And we have quite a few examples. And we have quite a few of his gold iridescence, but I felt like everyone knew those, so I wanted to bring out a little bit different. Here, a floriform vase, which he becomes incredibly also well known for. There's also beautiful Jack in the Pulpit ones. Just a really beautiful, simple flower-shaped vase that, again, you can see the iridescence that he's again figured out how to get on the glass in a really beautiful way, along with the opalescence above. And then this one's just like a nice one to show different techniques using kind of that vine lily pad look, which is very abstract, right? It has the look of a leaf, but is a little bit askew. And so he calls these fevrile, and he makes all forms of amazing objects. And he, again, uses his travels throughout the world to create forms that talk about international shapes he saw throughout the world in Islamic countries and in Africa. And so he's got a really interesting kind of viewpoint of bringing in all different influences into the art he makes. And then over here we've got probably one of the other better known glassmakers that in this Art Nouveau period, but really continued on throughout the 20th century and became probably better known for the glass they made in the 20th century, and it's Steuben. And Steuben was a glass manufactory that started in about 1903. And obviously, they realized that Tiffany's making this iridescence glass, we should too. And Frederick Carter, who was kind of an English glassmaker who had come to America and started his own manufactory with other people, was a glass genius. And he was a scientist and an artist and made, I think, 140 colors of glass, 7,000 shapes. He worked, I think, until 1939, and he might have been 90 by then. He was just intensely productive and crazy things he came out with in his mind. So these are just two examples of the many that Steuben made during the Carter period. And so you get this, they call their iridescence aurine. And this is a blue, and I particularly love the blue because the blue is just so beautiful. But their gold, you can tell it's a little bit different in tone from the Tiffany gold. So, once you start looking at all of them, many of them look very similar, so you have to just keep looking and feeling them and to understand what's different. And this is a perfume bottle, as you can see, and you get see the whole glass dipper. It's a very large perfume bottle. But again, using that just simple bird as the natural motif. And over here we've got a type of glass called verre de soie. And you can see the rainbow iridescence if you look at it closely. It's not in your face with color, but it's got that very, very simple, beautiful rainbow iridescence. And again, this kind of fan pattern vase is very typical. And so this was made about 1905 to 1930 is when, and verre de soie is being made in many different shapes. So obviously that type of glass transcends Art Nouveau and this kind of late Victorian period into what you would consider Art Deco. And so you see kind of a change in style. After Carter retires, Steuben moves to only making clear glass. And really, they begin with the Art Deco style and just continue with that to this day. And so there have been here and there a couple kind of smoky or topaz-y colors, but clear, this amazing crystal is what they become really well known for in the 20th century. And so they really leave behind this colorful Art Nouveau style, which again, Art Nouveau was very quickly decided it was terrible and lashed out against, and buildings were bulldozed, from 1910 on, which is crazy to think. It was the most popular thing in the world and then suddenly hated. And then the last two right over here are, again, variations on the American type of Art Nouveau design. And in America, obviously, glass makers were saying, oh, this is really popular. People are buying this. They want this iridescence. And so other glass makers started kind of thinking, oh, we need an art glass line. And art glass is not just iridescent glass. There's many different forms of colors and styles within the art glass idiom. And so you've got fine glass makers, cut glass makers, press glass makers, manufacturers, all kind of moving to have an art glass line. And these ones by Durand are also that kind of showing you a company that had a larger glassworks that then kind of honed in and made a focused art glass line. And this was only made from about 1924 to 1932 because Victor Durand, who it was at the Vineland Flint Glass Works in New Jersey, he died in a car accident. So after he was kind of the presence there, and once he was gone, there was no reason to make it anymore. And so again, you see that peacock, you see the iridescence, you see a peacock feather that becomes really popular like we were talking about before. So that feathering pattern becomes very typical. This trailing of spider webbing lines becomes something that they're really well known for, adding, again, another element of decoration. Yeah, and you can see it kind of the orangey yellow iridescence, and it's different. This one I just love because it's mold blown into this like optic mold. It's got these ridges on it, but then this really kind of psychedelic iridescent pattern that they call King Tut Swirl, but I have never been able to figure out why it was called King Tut Swirl. I've looked, and I feel like nobody really knows. It was probably just a name someone gave it to it at some point, and who knows if it was of the period or later. But I think it's definitely of the period, but I just don't. There's no real reasoning as to why. But you see again that harkening back to that undulating line. That is the basis of all of Art Nouveau. And while this is quite a bit later, you see how it's kind of continued on through time and how in America it continues and kind of starts to lose steam in the 1930s, but had a bit of a longer life in this country.